1787, the city of Philadelphia was host to two events that would change the course of history. The first was the writing of the U.S. Constitution, and there is no doubt about the impact that event had on our country. The second event is less well known, but it also transformed our nation. It was the introduction of the steamboat. Now, we may not consider the steamboat to be all that exciting today, but back in 1787, it was a big deal. In those days, there were no highways. Most roads were nothing more than muddy trails, and there were certainly no planes, trains, or automobiles. Traveling through the United States back then was time-consuming, difficult, and dangerous. The steamboat changed all that. It opened up new possibilities for travel and trade across the country. The first steamboat was invented by a man named John Fitch. It was noisy and strange-looking and used paddles similar to those used on a rowboat. Fitch named his boat Perseverance because he had battled those who doubted his abilities and others who wanted to claim the steamboat as their own invention. In fact, ever since it was first introduced, the steamboat was the subject of many personal and political battles. It was even at the center of one of the most important Supreme Court cases in history. By the 1800s, the steamboat's design had been improved and nearly perfected by Robert Fulton. Fulton and his business partner, Robert Livingston, were well known by politicians in the New York area. In 1808, New York lawmakers granted a 20-year monopoly for Fulton and Livingston to operate steamboats on the Hudson River. It was known as the Fulton-Livingston Monopoly.
They were told by the state of New York, if you can develop this steamship, and you can actually do it, we'll give you the exclusive rights to run your boat from the port of New York City to Elizabethtown for 20 years.
Competitors were simply not allowed, and consequently monopolies could provide poor service, charge monopoly prices, higher prices than competition would warrant, and certainly the public was in a take-it-or-leave-it situation.
Aaron Ogden was a former governor of New Jersey and had also served in the U.S. Senate. He saw the potential in operating steamboats and took full advantage of the monopoly. He took an assignment from Robert Fulton and began operating steamboats between New York and New Jersey. But he had some competition. Thomas Gibbons, a lawyer and former friend of Ogden, had received a federal coasting license to operate his steamboats on the same route Ogden was using. And not only was Gibbons running his boats on the Hudson in defiance of the monopoly, he was charging passengers less money, too.
Gibbons claims, wait a minute, New York, you don't have the right to claim these waters as your own and shut people from other states out.
He did have a license under the national government. The national government had passed a coasting act in the 1790s under which licenses were given, and Gibbons had a license under that. And so his claim was he had a federal right to enter into the waters of New York.
So you had two competing licenses, so to speak, the monopoly from New York that Ogden had and the federal license that Gibbons had.
Aaron Ogden was not about to give up so easily. He sued Thomas Gibbons, claiming Gibbons was violating his monopoly rights. He took his case to the New York courts, demanding they order Gibbons to stop running boats on the Hudson River.
Ogden asked for what we call an injunction, which basically means stop doing that. And the courts agreed with Ogden that he had this monopoly given to him legally by the state of New York, and that Gibbons couldn't do this.
Gibbons says, on the contrary, I have a federal license to navigate the waters of the United States. This was given to me pursuant to an act of Congress. As such, I can go anywhere the waterways of the United States take me. New York gives you your authority, the United States gives me mine.
Finally, in 1824, the case of Gibbons versus Ogden came to the Supreme Court. It was known as the Steamboat Monopoly case, and it attracted the interests of the whole country.
And so this was an important case in terms of regulating our commerce, our trade, our economics within the United States, and figuring out what power Congress had in this important area.
A second reason it attracted a lot of attention is because steam power was a novelty, a potentially very useful, lucrative form of transportation. And so a lot of people had an interest, much as people have a lot of interest to what extent the internet is going to be controlled or regulated by certain persons.
Ogden and Gibbons don't go to court over great constitutional questions. Ogden and Gibbons go to court because they are trying to make money. Gibbons is trying to make money by forcing himself into the New York trade. Ogden is trying to protect his profit margin by keeping Gibbons out.
The Supreme Court's decision would affect not just the two steamboat operators, but the entire country by determining how much power the federal government had over economic activity in the United States. In order to make a decision, the court had to turn to the document that was written in the same year the steamboat was introduced, the U.S. Constitution.
New York believed that the 10th Amendment, which says that the federal government only has the powers delegated to it and that all other powers are reserved to the states, that New York thereby had the power to regulate something like the waterways because no such power had been given to the federal government.
And Chief Justice Marshall has to answer two questions. The first question he has to answer, because what's being interpreted is something that's known as the Commerce Clause. One of the few enumerated powers that is given to Congress is the power to regulate interstate commerce, which means commerce among foreign nations, and then commerce among the Indian tribes, and commerce among the states. So the first question in Gibbons versus Ogden is, what is commerce? What does that mean? And the second question the court's ultimately going to decide is, if running a steamship from one port in one state to another port in another state does qualify as commerce, what does it mean when we're talking about the regulation of commerce among the states? Does it have to be something that goes beyond state boundaries, or sometimes can we say interstate commerce can take place among the states even if it's in New York?
Gibbons versus Ogden was the first Supreme Court case to deal with the Constitution's Commerce Clause. Since the power to regulate commerce among the several states is found in the list of Congress's enumerated powers, the court needed to determine the range of that power. In order to do so, the court first had to determine the definition of the word commerce and whether or not that definition included navigation.
When he got to talking about commerce, he quite literally went to dictionary definitions. And he talked about how all commerce means is commercial interaction. And navigation is a necessary part of commercial interaction.
Now, some people argued the clause in the Constitution has nothing to do with this ferry system. Commerce among the states means trading, that you're actually taking a good and selling it in another state. It has nothing to do with going between states and how you get there. That's not what Congress was given power to regulate. And others said, but wait a minute. If you have goods in one state and you want to get them to another, you got to transport them somehow. So it has to be broader than just selling and buying goods. It also has to include how you move from state to state.
In his opinion, Marshall wrote,
"Commerce undoubtedly is traffic, but it is something more. All America understands and has uniformly understood the word commerce to comprehend navigation. It was so understood and must have been so understood when the Constitution was framed."
After determining what commerce meant, the court had another challenge. The Commerce Clause says that Congress has the power to regulate commerce among the several states, but each side had a different definition of the word among.
Ogden would argue that among simply means commerce between two states, commerce across a state line. If a seller in New York wants to sell something to a purchaser in New Jersey, that is among. Marshall construed it more liberally. Among includes commerce that takes place in the interior of another state.
If you think to Gibbons and Ogden, there's no actual crossing state lines going on there, is there? Because they're out in the water. And what ends up happening is John Marshall interprets that phrase, among the several states, to include not just sales that cross state lines, but sales even within one state that affect commerce in other states. So the moment he did that, the moment he dropped that interpretation on the phrase, Congress became able to reach a whole wide slew of transactions that were going on totally within one state, as long as you could say, yes, but they will affect commerce in other states.
So, the court had so far determined that commerce included navigation, and that among referred to more states than one. But it was how the court defined the term to regulate that was most important.
Marshall says regulation means the capacity to create all rules by which an activity will occur. He says Congress's power over commerce is plenary, complete, total.
In speaking about what Congress's power under the Commerce Clause actually was, Chief Justice Marshall wrote,
It is the power to regulate, that is, to prescribe the rule by which commerce is to be governed. This power, like all others vested in Congress, is complete in itself, may be exercised to its utmost extent, and acknowledges no limitations other than are prescribed in the Constitution.
The court ruled that the New York monopoly law was in conflict with the Constitution and therefore void. The Constitution's Commerce Clause gave Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce, and the Constitution was the supreme law of the land. Therefore, New York had to comply with federal law.
Congress has passed a law. The state passed a law. Looking at those two laws, Marshall believes they're in conflict, and consequently, as he had established in Marbury, when that occurs, the federal law must prevail.
So much like what we saw in McCulloch versus Maryland and other cases, this is another case where the state's saying we have the right to legislate something in our territory, and the federal government comes in and says, yes, but that territory is not just yours as a state, it belongs to the federal government, belongs to all of the people.
And just like that, the Fulton-Livingston monopoly was over. The court had ruled that Congress had the power to regulate interstate commerce, and Thomas Gibbons was once again free to conduct business on the Hudson River.
As a result of the decision in Gibbons versus Ogden, the steamboat industry just exploded. The destruction of the monopolies led to an increase 4, 5, 6-fold of the number of steamboats operating on the Hudson River. Monopolies nationwide were abolished by the Gibbons versus Ogden doctrine, and the decision is credited as having just an extraordinary effect on the economy of early America.
I could trace through many cases, which I won't do to bore you, the Gibbons versus Ogden decision right through to the passage of the new Health Care Act by Congress 2 years ago, right through to the Social Security Act that pays for your grandparents' pension, right through to Medicare that pays for medical care for the aged, right through to Congress sending money to your school for improving your education system and helping you buy books. And the reason why I can draw that line is that if you look at the Constitution, there is absolutely nothing that says specifically Congress can pass the Social Security Act, or Congress can pass the Medicare Act, or Congress can pass a bill that sends money to your state to buy books or to provide certain kinds of education. So where does Congress get this power to do all this stuff? And it's the Commerce Clause.
While the court's decision in Gibbons versus Ogden affected commerce in the U.S., the Supreme Court would soon be faced with making decisions that would deeply affect the lives of individuals. It would also find itself at odds with a president and unable to prevent one of the most tragic events in American history.